Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me along virtually today. I'm going to present on the governance challenges and recommendations for Marine Cloud Brightening today. And this work comes out of some work that was done by the regulatory sub-program as part of RAP. And we were lucky enough to have Dan Harrison along from Gully and Shading as well, which really helped us in the science side of things here. So before we get started, I wanted to just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm coming to you today and on which this work was done, which are the Yagara and Turrbal people here in the Edge. And I'd like to extend my respect to their elders, past and present. A bit of background to start. Why did we decide to look into the governance of marine cloud brightening? Well, it's one of these emerging technologies being considered and investigated globally for its potential conservation purposes. Now, as an emerging technology, it presents novel risks and uncertainties, so the decision-making context has a lack of information, which can be really challenging. And given that it's emerging, there aren't really specifically designed frameworks already in place to manage the risks and uncertainties. We did our review through a systematic approach, looking to identify challenges and recommendations for MCB governance. We did broaden our search to solar radiation management, which is a broader set of technologies under which marine cloud brightening is often characterised. That's because there was very limited literature out there already in marine cloud brightening. So we reviewed 27 publications, and from that we identified a set of challenges and recommendations. So, as I said, three broad challenges were identified from the literature. The first set of those challenges related to the technical aspects of governance. So unsurprisingly, one of the major issues here relates to the uncertainty of these technologies in relation to the impacts that they might have, but also their potential benefits. There's a lot of uncertainty around that, which is very difficult to deal with in governance frameworks. The second of those challenges related to technological lock-in. So there's concern that if we did research or develop technologies, then we might be locked into using them, that there would be, I guess, an incentive to use them as opposed to other solutions or opportunities that might come up. The third of those challenges relates to termination shock. So the concern that if deployment was to cease, there could be quite significant and sudden negative impacts, and how to deal with that through governance was another challenge. The second set of challenges there relates to the legitimacy of governance. So a lot of these concerns are about the democratic processes that are used to deal with these technologies. And transboundary effects was a real challenge here, one of the key challenges identified, I should say, because there is a concern that if one jurisdiction sanctioned and indeed deployed these technologies, that there could be impacts in a neighbouring jurisdiction who might not have been involved in that decision-making process. So that was a challenge identified. Perhaps not surprisingly again, public acceptability is a concern in this space. There's no secret, I guess, that these technologies can be very controversial, I suppose. And so that's a concern in terms of how to develop effective approaches to manage these technologies. The concern about weaponisation by state or non-state actors was also raised in the literature. And finally, there was concern about the narrow range of perspectives that might be consulted in decision-making and that marginalised voices might get a say. That leads very nicely into the ethical challenges, and I really want to draw your attention to the first of those, which relates to the moral hazard challenge, which is this idea that if we fund processes to research these technologies, then they might be privileged rather than emissions reduction technologies and climate mitigation strategies. That sort of colours as well the other ethical challenges. So there was a lot of discussion about the extent to which private funding is appropriate in this area and whether it is appropriate. Concerns about the use of this technology exacerbating existing inequalities. And that particularly fed into that next challenge, which related to intergenerational equity, recognising that our current generation will make decisions about whether to use or whether not to use this technology. And the people that are most affected by those decisions are future generations, who obviously don't get properly represented in decision making. The final of those challenges was human hubris, associated with the idea of using these technologies. Again, we had three broad categories that we identified from the literature of recommendations this time. So the first of those related to potential governance approaches that might be best suited to addressing the particular challenges of a novel technology like marine cloud brightening. So there is a real range of these. I actually won't go through them in detail, just in the interests of time. But I want to draw your attention to this first one, international cooperation. This was a really popular recommendation. The majority of papers in our review that talked about international cooperation talked about it quite favourably. However, there was also a lot of skepticism about the extent to which it was actually feasible or achievable, I guess, particularly given the fact that it took a really long time to get that international consensus and convention making around climate change. So a concern that it would be really challenging to achieve any kind of agreement in this area. I think I'll leave the other approaches. Suffice to say, each of them sort of had different positives and negatives in terms of trying to address some of the uncertainty and some of those democratic challenges that we're dealing with according to the literature. That second set of recommendations we termed engagement, so it related to the extent to which broader members of society are engaged in the development of governance and through the governance processes themselves, and how messaging about these technologies and indeed the engagement themselves is communicated more broadly to society. So again, it's responding to those challenges of sort of public acceptability and the moral hazard challenge. So that's what the framing really goes to, recognizing that if such technologies were to be researched or even deployed, they needed to be, I guess, positioned as something that happens in tandem with climate mitigation strategies and emissions reduction. Otherwise, in engagement, there was a real emphasis on the importance of frequent and meaningful stakeholder engagement, and I believe there have probably been a number of presentations in relation to this issue more generally about RAP over the last few days. So I won't go into it too deeply, but again, transparency was recognised as really important to any process there to try to build any kind of public confidence and ensure that there is that sort of accountability for these technologies, given that we're dealing with potential novel risks and uncertainties. There was some discussion about the extent to which non-state actors can play a role in governance. They might have to if there isn't any governance already established. And finally, that last category of recommendations related to explicitly addressing the risks, and they varied quite considerably. I'll particularly draw your attention to that recommendation for tiered risk assessment because that was very favourably discussed in the literature. The key takeaways from that broad overview of the current literature in this space were that there is real concern about the moral implications of these technologies and the extent to which that can be addressed through governance. And indeed, that question of whether governance could effectively address the challenges was very much still contentious from the literature we reviewed. From that literature review then, we identified two key knowledge gaps at this stage. The first relates to specific guidance for marine cloud brightening, which was quite limited in the literature. And the second relates to the details of how recommendations could be practically implemented on the ground. The first of those knowledge gaps that we identified relates to the scale and rationale behind the particular technologies being governed and the extent to which that actually affects what type of governance is needed. So as I mentioned earlier, we extended our literature review to include solar radiation management technologies because there was very limited guidance in relation to marine cloud brightening. And that group of technologies includes a real range in terms of scales, as you can see on the figure on screen. So we're dealing with both smaller scale technologies like marine cloud brightening, but also those global scale approaches you can see on screen. And you can imagine that those might have quite significant implications for the severity of the challenges we're dealing with and what types of measures might be appropriate. But that wasn't really addressed in the literature. So digging into that a little bit more deeply, transboundary effects is one clear challenge that might be less challenging if we're dealing with very small scale approaches, like marine cloud brightening has the potential to be in some cases. And so that's something that would need to be taken into account in developing governance. That would have flow-on effects for the extent to which international cooperation might be needed, given that there might not be that cross-jurisdictional issue. But again, this is something that needs to be considered in more depth and just wasn't in the literature. I'll leave the moral hazard one to one side today, just in the interest of time. I'm swiftly running out of time, but I just wanted to briefly touch on that second knowledge gap in the literature we reviewed, and that related to that on-ground implementation of any of those recommendations for governance. There was a real dearth of information about that, and particularly in relation to that stakeholder engagement recommendation, sort of the who, what, how of that, there was very limited information on that. And I'll just direct you to hopefully a paper in future out of this work that will go into a bit more detail about this particular gap. So to sort of wrap everything up, through this review that we did, we identified a really complex set of challenges and recommendations that should be considered when we're thinking about designing potentially ethical and effective governance for marine cloud brightening. So it's certainly a useful guide, but those knowledge gaps we identified suggest that there probably needs to be more context-specific evaluation of this governance challenge that we have. Looking forward, we might gain some more guidance, I guess, from the emerging technologies literature about how to make decisions in circumstances of great uncertainty. So thank you so much for listening. That's it from me. I'm happy to take any questions, especially given I skipped over a few of the details here and there in the interest of time. So thanks so much.